Smoke should not have been rising from that building. Not from a dead meeting hall on the edge of the prairie, not in the first hard week of winter, and not from a place they had handed to a grieving woman because nobody else knew what to do with her. People stopped in the road and stared, because 3 days earlier, they had laughed when she tore up the floor. By morning, they would be begging to get beneath it. The hall stood half a mile outside the settlement, alone on a rise where the Wyoming wind had nothing to slow it down. It had once been a meeting place, then a school for one brief season, then a storage room in a lean year, and then, for too long, nothing at all. By the time Eliza Wren climbed the hill with one mule, 2 blankets, a cast-iron kettle, and the last of her husband's tools tied behind her in a wagon, the building already looked like something winter had chosen. The north side leaned. The roof had sunk at one corner, a shutter knocked loose against the wall in every gust, and when she forced the front door open, the cold inside felt older than the air outside. Not sharper, just settled, the kind of cold that had lived there long enough to belong. Eliza stood in the middle of the empty hall and said nothing. She was 27 years old, a widow for 19 days, and the only thing Thomas Wren had left her was his name, a few tools, and a silence at the center of her life that still did not feel real when morning came. Thomas had died on a freight run west of the settlement. A wheel snapped in frozen ruts. The load shifted. The horses bolted. By the time the men got him out from under the timber, the cold had already turned his coat stiff around the shoulders. There had been no final speech, no last promise, only the news brought back before sunrise, and the sound of a house changing around her by evening. Not in anger, in arithmetic. Thomas's brother would take the team. His sister's children needed room. Feed was short, flour was shorter, and another winter was already pressing down out of the north. So 4 days after the burial, Ezra Wren sat across from her at the kitchen table and offered her the old haul. He spoke carefully, like a man trying to wrap necessity in decent words. Said the stone piers were still good. Said there was a roof, mostly. Said a woman alone might manage there for a while if she was careful. He never called it charity. He did not need to. His wife, Miriam, was already folding away the spare bedding before the conversation ended. So Eliza took what was hers and left before dawn the next day. A splitting maul, a short shovel, 2 sacks of potatoes, 3 jars of salt pork sealed in grease, a coffee tin of nails she had straightened by hand, Thomas's hand auger, her father's folding rule. Not enough for comfort, enough for a beginning. Inside the hall, she made herself look slowly, at the roof, at the windows, at the seams in the wallboards, at the old stovepipe collar near the rear beam. Most people would have started above, where the leaks were obvious. Eliza started below. The floor was wrong. Even through her boots she could feel it. Every bit of warmth that might have held in that room was being dragged low and away. The drafts ran across the boards like creek water. She crouched near the center where 2 planks had worked apart, held a lamp near the crack, watched the flame bend. Then she went down on one knee and pressed her hand flat to the floor. Air moved there. Not much, but enough. Enough to tell her the hall was hollow underneath. She fetched the iron poker and pried at the first board. It groaned but gave way. Then another. Then a third. Below the planks was a narrow crawlspace over packed earth, stone set at the edges, dry in the middle, sheltered from the full sweep of the wind. The air down there was cold, but steady. That was the word that mattered. Not warm. Steady. A place that did not rise and fall with every gust. A place the prairie could not strip bare in an hour. Eliza sat back on her heels and looked into the opening for a long moment. Most women in her place would have patched the roof first. Most men would have said the same. But roofs failed in storms. Walls leaked heat. And above-ground rooms belonged to the wind the minute the fire dropped. The earth was different. The earth kept what it could. That's where she would live. Not in the big room. Not fighting the whole sky. Under it. By late afternoon she had 6 planks stacked by the wall, and a shallow pit open between the joists. Her hands were raw. Her skirt hem was streaked with dirt, and the hall no longer looked abandoned. It looked interrupted. That was when the first person saw her. A boy from town, cutting across the road with a sled rope over his shoulder, stopped at the gate and stared through the open door. He saw a widow alone in a dead hall, ripping up the floor. By sunset, half the settlement had heard she was chopping the place apart. By supper, the story had improved itself. Some said grief had turned her strange. Some said she meant to burn the boards for heat. Some said she was digging her own grave under the building, because she knew she would never outlast the winter anyway. That last version made people laugh. Not cruelly. Just with the easy confidence of people certain they understood how the season worked. Eliza heard none of it. She worked by lamplight until the blue dark pressed hard against the windows. One shovel of earth. Then another. Then another. Below the floor, the sound changed. The wind still scraped and worried at the walls above her. But down in that half-hidden pocket, the noise thinned out. The quiet under the hall felt impossible. And because it felt impossible, she trusted it. When she finally climbed back up, night had settled over the prairie. The loose shutter kept knocking. The seams in the north wall shone silver with moonlight. Somewhere far off, a coyote barked once and went silent. Eliza stood over the opening she had made and listened to the weather gathering itself. Then she looked at the broken hall around her, and for the first time since Thomas died, she saw something that was not loss. She saw a chance, not to live well, not yet, just to live long enough. At first light, they would come to look, and when they saw the hole in the floor, they would laugh. By the second morning, the hole in Eliza's floor had more story than depth. In town they were already calling it her cellar, her den, her grave, depending on who was talking and how brave they felt. Up at the hall, it was just a rectangle of missing boards and a woman with a shovel. Corbin Hayes came first. He was a wagoner with frost in his beard and a limp from an old break. The kind of man who measured winter in years, not in storms. He stepped through the door, let his eyes adjust, and saw the opening in the floor. Boards stacked neat against the wall. Joists bare. A shallow pit below, its sides cut square and clean. Eliza was kneeling at the edge, tamping the dirt flat. "You digging a cellar, widow?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Digging lower than the wind, Mr. Hayes." "Lower than what?" He snorted. "The sky?" She finally faced him. "Roof leaks," she said. "Walls leak worse. The wind likes anything it can reach." She pointed to the seams along the north wall where cold air slid in like water under a door. "That's where it comes in." Then she nodded to the pit. "This is where it doesn't." Corbin stepped closer. He felt the draft at his knees near the wall, sharp and eager. Over the pit, it slowed, like something under there was holding its breath. He crouched and held his hand above the dirt. "Still cold," he said. "Warmer than tomorrow," she answered. "And it won't change as fast." She tapped the floor. "The earth is slow, Mr. Hayes. The air is fast. I'm trying to give my heat to the thing that doesn't run." It was a strange sentence. It made more sense than it should have. "You plan to live under your own floor?" he asked. "If that's what it takes," she said. He almost laughed. Almost. Instead he glanced at the crooked pipe stubs still clinging to the ceiling. "You'll need a stove," he muttered. "Not just a hole." She pointed. "There used to be one. Church sold it. Thomas's brothers took the iron. Left the draft." She nodded at the pit. "So I'm giving the draft a different path." That afternoon, Corbin came back with a length of bent tin and another man at his shoulder. "Clem Harker," butcher. Heavy set, hands like hands, laughed too ready. He stopped inside the door, stared at the opening, and grinned. You know there's easier ways to die than digging your own grave, Mrs. Wren. Eliza kept measuring the gap between joists with a folding rule. 3 boards wide, she murmured. 10 feet long. Deep enough to sleep. Too shallow to drown. Clem chuckled. You really going to crawl in there when the snow comes? I'm going to stop sleeping where the wind can find me, she said. Corbin set the tin down. She wants to run stovepipe under the floor, he told Clem. Heat the earth, then the air. Let it come back up slow. Clem stared. You serious? Serious enough to climb this hill twice, Corbin answered. Eliza took the tin in both hands, as if it were worth more than it looked. Thomas saved this from an old stove, she said. Told me we might need it one winter. At the pit. We didn't get that winter together. I get this one. They worked until the sun slid flat behind the prairie. Corbin cut the tin into a long trough. Eliza bent the edges and nailed them to the joists, making a narrow sleeve that ran under the boards. Clem held wood, swore at the cold, and stole glances at the woman who talked about air like it could be fenced. When they were done, a channel lay hidden beneath the floor, open at one end where a stove might feed it, rising toward the old pipe collar at the other. So smoke's going to run under your feet now? Clem asked. Not smoke, Eliza said. The warm air around it. Smoke can go up and out. She brushed dust from her skirt. I only want the part that doesn't hurry. By the 3rd day, the story had grown on the walk between the hall and the store. Some said she was building herself a den like a fox. Some said she was too proud to sleep under another man's roof. Some said the grief had turned sharp instead of soft, and this was what sharp grief did. Miriam Wren heard every version without asking for one. She lasted one more night, listening to the wind push under her own door, then pulled on a shawl and went up the hill. The hall looked worse from the outside than she'd remembered. Roof sagged, north wall gapped, smoke curling from the old vent like a line on a sketch. Inside, Eliza was fixing a stout frame around the opening, building a lip so a heavy lid could sit tight. 2 chairs. A small pile of split wood. No comfort yet, just intention. Miriam's gaze went straight to the hole. So it's true, she said. You've gone under. Eliza set the hammer down. I've gone where the wind has to work harder to find me. Miriam stepped to the edge and peered down. The pit was only as deep as a man's knee, but the air had a different weight. Not kinder, exactly. Just less eager to move. You'll get sick, Miriam said. Damp lungs, bad air. Father says so. It's dry, Eliza replied. Stone at the sides. Packed dirt at the bottom. No melt yet. You can't know that. Eliza's jaw tightened. I know the difference between air that wants to run and air that wants to stay. This, she nodded down, stays. Miriam's mouth thinned. People say you're scared. Eliza didn't flinch. I am. I'm just scared of the right thing. She glanced at the high walls. Not of being alone. Of being cold with too much roof and not enough ground. Miriam looked away, toward the town you could not quite see through the blowing snow. You could have stayed with us, she whispered. Eliza watched her. There wasn't room, she said. Miriam let out a breath that clouded in the air between them. No, there wasn't. Eliza turned back to the opening. Then I'll make room here. For yourself. For whoever runs out of firewood first. On the 4th day, Reuben the blacksmith hauled a small rusted stove up the hill on a sled. Had this sitting by my forge, he grunted. Wife says if I don't get rid of it, she'll melt it down herself. Crazy hole might as well have a heart. They patched a crack near the door with clay and ash, set the stove beside the pit, and threaded pipe from its back into the tin sleeve. When Eliza lit the first fire, smoke hesitated, then followed the path she carved for it. Under the floor, through the hidden channel, and up into the hard winter air. Inside, nothing dramatic happened. No sudden rush of heat. No miracle. Just a slow, stubborn change. The boards over the pit lost their bite. The air in the center of the room stopped chasing every gust. Eliza opened the hatch and bent close. The warmth rising out was slight, but it was there. Enough to fog her breath for a heartbeat. Enough to prove she hadn't gone mad for nothing. By week's end, the routine had settled. At dawn, a thin line of smoke climbed from a building everyone had written off. By midday, the road carried gossip uphill. "She's heating from the floor," they said in Becker's store. "She's living under it," others answered. Either way, they laughed. Because the real blizzards hadn't hit yet. Because their own stoves were still winning, for now. The first woman to come for more than a look was Hattie Long. She arrived with a basket of mending and a cough she didn't want to claim. "They say it's different in here," she said at the door. Eliza nodded to the center boards. "Try it." Hattie stepped over the pit, boots on wood that looked like any other. Then Eliza lifted the hatch. Warm air touched Hattie's face, carrying iron and ash and something she hadn't felt since September. "Oh," she breathed. Not summer. Not comfort. Just the feeling that the cold was, for once, not sharper than she was. "You mind if I sew here a while?" Hattie asked. Eliza shrugged. "Long as you bring your own chair and don't stand in the doorway." Hattie came back the next day. And the next. By the time the river froze solid, 2 more women had joined her, their hands busy over the boards above a room no one could see, warming themselves on borrowed heat from the ground. The men kept joking about Eliza's hole. But the jokes grew shorter whenever the wind pushed under their own doors at night. They'd remember the hills soon enough. They just didn't know when. By January, the cold stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like a verdict. It was the kind of cold that didn't shout at the windows anymore. It just settled in the bones of the buildings and waited. In town, chimneys smoked from before dawn to after dark. Woodpiles shrank into ragged stacks. Men counted cords with a tighter jaw each week. Up on the hill, the hall smoked too. Thin lines of gray rose from the old roof vent most days now, straight up when the air was still, torn sideways when the wind found it. Inside, the change was quiet. The north wall still hissed where the wind slid through broken boards. Frost still crawled along the window corners. But in the middle of the room, above the hidden winter chamber, the air moved slow. Eliza woke each morning before the sky had a color. She would stir the coals in the little stove, feed them with careful handfuls of split wood, and listen for the soft rush as warm air slipped into the tin sleeve and disappeared under the boards. Then she'd lift the hatch a crack. It was never hot under there, but it was never as sharp as outside. The ground was doing what she had asked it to do, holding. By the second week of deep snow, Hattie Long no longer bothered to pretend she was just visiting. She arrived most days with a basket of mending and 1 child in tow. The boy wrapped so tight in a quilt he looked more bundle than human. His nose ran. His eyes watered. He did not cough as much in the hall as he did at home. He would curl up on a folded blanket near the center boards, close enough to feel the rising warmth through the wood, and fall asleep with his cheeks more pink than gray. Eliza watched without comment. Hattie noticed, on the 3rd such day, that Eliza had started stacking their wood along the inside of the north wall. "Why there?" she asked. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron. "Wood's worth 2 things," she said. "Fire and space." She nodded at the scenes. "If I can't stop the wind, I can make it fight harder to get in." The woodpile now acted like a second wall, a slow, solid weight that blunted the worst of the gusts. It didn't fix the drafts. It dulled them. The first man who came up the hill because he needed the place, not because he wanted a story, came one hard blue afternoon. It was Clem. He carried a ham over his shoulder, wrapped in cloth, and looked less sure of his own jokes than usual. He set the meat on a crate near the stove. "My smokehouse ain't pulling right," he said. "Wind keeps pushing back down the chimney. I got meat turning slick on one side and leather on the other." He jerked his chin at the boards. "You really running smoke under there?" "Some. Heat more than smoke." She lifted the hatch. Warm air brushed his face, carrying a faint tinge of iron and ash. He sniffed. "Not much smell." "I don't need much," she said. "Just enough to keep it from lying dead." He stared down into the dark. "You think you can hang a ham over that?" "Maybe." She fetched the rough frame she'd rigged from scraps, 2 cross pieces, and a row of hooks. They set it over the opening while the hatch was propped half open, letting a narrow column of rising warmth lick the hanging meat. Not a strong current, not a smokehouse roar, just a constant, steady pull. Clem shook his head. "Never thought I'd trust my winter meat to a hole in a church floor," he muttered. "It's not a church," Eliza said. "It's a room that does one thing right." "What's that?" he asked. "It remembers." He snorted. "The ground?" "Heat," she said. "Heat remembers where it's been if you give it something to hold." He didn't understand the words. He understood the result. 3 days later, he cut a thin slice off the ham and chewed in silence. "It's even," he said finally. "No raw edge. No burned edge." He wrapped it back in cloth, nodded once, and walked off the hill without another joke. By the end of that week, 2 more pieces of meat had come up the track. Word slid down into town, and along the counter at the store. "You can hang a ham over her floor, and it comes out right," they said. Men pretended to scoff, but some counted how many hams they had left. The winter kept tightening. Snow piled against cabin doors until they opened onto white walls. Outbuildings groaned under the weight. A wagon team was found frozen in its traces one morning, still hitched, still standing, eyes clouded over. Inside those cabins, people moved less. They burned wood faster. They sat closer to the stove. They watched the frost creep along the walls. The jokes about Eliza's hole grew thin. Nobody wanted to admit it aloud, but there was a line in their minds now. Cabins above, room below, high and losing heat, low and holding it. One night, Miriam woke to the sound of her own shutters rattling like teeth. She got up, wrapped herself, and went to the front room. The stove was out. The air had gone thin and sharp. Her father-in-law stood there in his shirt sleeves, feeding the fire with small, quick motions, his breath hard in the lamplight. "Wood's going faster than it should," he muttered. "We'll have to start burning fence if this keeps up." Miriam thought of the hill, of the boards above the hidden space, of the way the air had risen soft against her face when Eliza lifted the hatch. She wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "We could ask her," she said quietly. "Ask her what? How she's burning so little and not freezing." Ezra's jaw clenched. "We're not crawling under that floor," he said. "Not yet." He meant pride. Miriam heard fear. Back at the hall, Eliza rationed her with the way some women ration sugar. She knew how many splits the stove needed to keep the winter room breathing, how many she could spare to heat the top air when other people came. She never said it aloud, but she had begun thinking in numbers that were not days, or cords, or miles. She thought in degrees between one room and another, between the air above the river ice and the air over her floor, between the cold that killed quickly and the cold that could be turned aside, just enough. Hattie noticed the difference first, not in theory, in a child. Her boy stopped waking in the night with his teeth chattering, stopped coughing so hard his ribs shook. He still got cold, everybody did, but he no longer looked like something the winter had already claimed. One afternoon, while the women sewed and the stove burned low, Hattie looked up from her stitching. "If you hadn't dug that," she nodded at the boards, "I think he'd be sicker." Eliza didn't answer. She didn't know if it was true. She only knew what she could touch. She reached down, lifted the hatch a handspan, and let a little more warmth up into the circle of their chairs. By February, the land had gone past pretty. Nothing soft was left. The sky was a lid. The snow along the fence lines had turned gray where the wind had scraped it bare and laid it down again. Men counted their logs by lamplight and did not say out loud that the pile would not last until spring. That was when the talk of a real blizzard began. Not the smaller squalls that had come and gone. The kind the old men remembered from years they didn't like to describe. Days without seeing the sun, gates buried, drifts as high as a man on horseback. Rumor reached the hall the way everything else did, on boots and in breath. Corbin brought it one evening, stamping snow from his feet. "They say weather's turning bad even for out here," he said. "Cattle found standing under snow in the breaks. Wind choirs you can hear before you feel them." He looked at the boards under Eliza's chair. "You ready for that?" She glanced at the stove, the sleeve, the wood against the wall, the hatch. "Ready as I know how to be," she said. Corbin grunted. Most folks are still trusting their chimneys and their luck. Eliza's mouth tightened. "Luck's just weather with a different name." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "When it hits," he said quietly, "they're going to remember you've got a room under your feet." Her eyes didn't leave the stove. "They'll remember when their roofs start giving heat back to the sky," she said. "And if they come?" Eliza's hand rested on the boards over her winter room. "Then they'd better be willing to get low." Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere beyond the flats, clouds were already gathering. The hall, with its sagging roof and broken boards, waited on the hill. So did the room nobody else had thought to build. The one place in that country where the cold would have to work harder than usual to do what it always did. Take. The storm they've been talking about came on a day that started almost quiet. Gray sky. No sun. No shadow. Snow fine as dust, drifting sideways, not impressive yet, just constant. By midday, the line between ground and sky was gone. The town disappeared into a moving white. The hill disappeared too, but the winds did not forget it. Eliza knew this storm was different before it reached the walls. Other storms slapped the building, came in bursts, then faded. This one leaned. A steady, endless pressure pressed the north wall inward until every board hummed. The loose shutter didn't rattle anymore, it stayed pinned flat against the siding like a hand over a mouth. She checked the stove. Coals red, flame small, pipe drawing under the floor and up through the roof, smoke pulling straight despite the wind. She lifted the hatch a crack. Warm air eased past her fingers, not much, but the air under the boards was already different from the air in the room, and very different from the air outside. She set the lid back down and felt the boards tremble as another long gust pushed. By early afternoon, snow had buried the steps. The small front window turned to blind glass. The world beyond it vanished. Then the knocking started. It came thin at first, a rapid, frightened rattle on the door, almost lost in the wind. Eliza shoved the bar aside and pulled the door in. Hattie Long all but fell through, hair and scarf white with rime, dragging her youngest boy like a sack. His lips were gray, his eyes unfocused. Behind them, the storm roared in, a white wall, stinging air, noise. Eliza forced the door shut with her shoulder until the latch caught. "Get away from the wall," she said. "Center. Now." Hattie stumbled toward the boards above the winter room. Eliza spread 2 blankets on the floor. "Lay him here." Hattie's hands shook too badly to untie the scarf. Eliza cut it with her knife, brushed snow off the boy's face, and pressed her palm flat to the floor beside his cheek. Warmth rose up, faint but real. "He's not gone," Eliza said quietly. "Not while I can still feel that." Hattie made a sound that was half sob, half breath. More pounding hit the door. Corbin forced it open with his shoulder, snow spilling in around him. He had an arm around Miriam Wren, her shawl stiff with ice, her face pale. Ezra came after them, hunched, dragging 2 small sacks of wood. The wind tried to follow. Eliza slammed the door again, dropped the bar, and turned back to the center. She could feel it now, the hall shaping itself around the one thing in it that didn't give up heat easily. People were pulled toward the boards over the hidden room the way cold hands are pulled toward flame. "What in God's name have you built here?" Ezra rasped, chest heaving. Eliza kept her voice low. "A room that doesn't give itself to the sky so fast." She fed 2 small splits into the stove, shut the door, watched the pipe steady. The wind leaned harder. Something outside went over, with a deep, dragging crash. Nobody said the word roof. They crowded in until the hall was more bodies than air. Clem arrived with his beard full of snow, and no jokes left. "Stove won't draw," he gasped. "Smoke's going sideways. House feels colder with a fire than without." He looked down at the floor. "Please." Eliza nodded once. "If you're in here, you get low," she said. "There's no warmth near the walls." They obeyed. Men who'd never taken orders from her in their lives moved to the center, boots over the boards that looked like any other but weren't. Children were wrapped in quilts and laid along the blankets above the hatch, their faces turned toward the slow-rising breath of the winter room. Hours blurred. The wind had no edges now, just one long, grinding push. The north wall groaned. A nail gave way with a sharp pop. Snow snuck in through a new crack, curling in fine powder along the baseboard. Corbin swore under his breath. "She's failing," he said. Eliza shook her head. "The wall is. The room isn't." She grabbed armfuls of split wood and fence rail and slammed them into place against the north boards, building the pile higher. "Help her," she said. No one argued. They turned their precious firewood into a brace, stacking it up the wall until the draft slowed and the snow line stopped creeping. Behind the barrier, the wind clawed and howled. In the room, the air above the hatch stayed almost steady. Hattie's boy began to shiver. Violent, ugly shakes that rattled his teeth. Hattie tried to press him still. Eliza stopped her. "Let him fight," she murmured. "It's when they get quiet you worry." The child cried once, then pulled in a breath that steamed the air in front of his mouth. It was the smallest proof, but everyone close enough to see it felt something loosen in their chest. Miriam slid down the wall and ended up on the boards beside Eliza, knees pulled tight. "I told Father we wouldn't be crawling under your floor," she whispered. Eliza didn't look at her. "You aren't," she said. "You're just sitting above what's saving you." Miriam gave a broken laugh that turned into a cough. "I was wrong about what would fail first," she said. "Walls or pride?" Eliza tended the stove with careful hands. "Both," she said. "That's why you give your heat to something sturdier." She tapped the boards lightly. "The ground doesn't care if we're proud. It just keeps what we give it." Night came without anyone seeing it. The window stayed white. The seam under the door hissed faintly where snow pressed hard against it. People dozed sitting up, and woke with a start. Nobody asked what time it was. Time was the number of small logs left in the bin. The number of breaths you could see in front of a child's face. The number of times the boards in the roof complained before going quiet again. At some deep hour when the storm felt like it might go on forever, the sound changed. Not much, just enough for old ears to hear it. And lost a little of its weight. The boards in the hall stopped humming, and went back to creaking, loud but less endless. Corbin pushed himself up, and scraped a clear circle on the frozen window with his thumb. "Still mostly white," he said. "But the sky's got a color now. Not just one color. Shifts." He turned back, eyes small and bright. "We're past the middle of it." Eliza did not open the door. She kept the fire small, kept the hatch half open, felt the warmth under the floor like a living thing that could be tired if she asked too much all at once. Ezra stood near her, hat in his hands, fingers raw where the cold had split the skin. "We'd have burned the last of the fence tonight," he said. She nodded. "And it still wouldn't have been enough," he finished. His voice thinned. "You did this." She didn't lift her eyes from the stove. "You gave me the worst building you had," she said softly. "You didn't ask what I saw when I walked in." He swallowed. "What did you see?" She glanced at the boards beneath them. "Not a hall," she said. "A place the wind hadn't claimed yet." When they finally lifted the bar from the door, gray light slipped in around the edges. Snow fell inward in a slab. The air that rushed in was brutally cold, but flat, not driving. The storm had spent itself. They dug themselves out like people climbing from inside a buried box. Outside, the world was changed. Barn roofs lay broken under drifts. Fence lines vanished. Paths erased. But the hall stood. Crooked, ugly, patched with wood that knew too many winters, but standing. Behind, under their boots, the winter room lay quiet, heat finally bleeding away now that it wasn't needed so desperately. They trickled out into the wrecked morning and turned, almost as one, to look back. "This is more of a church than it ever was," Corbin said under his breath. Eliza shook her head. "It's not a church." Ezra squinted at her. "Then what?" She let her hand rest on the doorframe. "Proof," she said, "that sometimes the only way through a winter is down." Miriam looked at the beaten faces, the children, the heap of wood still braced against the north wall. "We'll forget that," she said quietly. "Come summer." Eliza nodded. "That's why the room has to stay," she answered. "Memories wander. Cold doesn't." No one said it aloud, but every person on that hill understood something that would follow them for the rest of their lives. When the walls gave up, they had lived because a woman nobody wanted to house had dug a room the wind could not reach. And whichever direction they walked when they left that morning, they walked differently, knowing that the safest place they'd ever been in a storm was beneath their own feet. Spring did not fix what the storm had broken. It just made the damage visible. Snow slumped away from fences that no longer stood. Mud swallowed wagon ruts where roads had been. Broken rafters stuck out of drifts like ribs. The settlement began the hard work of counting what was left and pretending not to count who was missing. Up on the hill, the hall looked worse than ever. The siding was more warped. The north wall leaned into the memory of the wind. The roof had a new sag. But people walked up there now without needing an invitation. They came with hammer and saw, with rope and pitch, with boards scavenged from sheds that hadn't made it through. Clem patched shingles alongside Reuben. Corbin reset a pier stone that had shifted. Two boys hauled mud for chinking and bragged later they had helped fix the winter house, even though they'd barely lifted more than buckets. Eliza moved among them, measuring, marking, saying little. She kept one thing the same. She would not let anyone nail the hatch shut. She sanded the boards above the winter room smooth where boots had chewed them, oiled the hinges, checked the sleeve under the floor with a practiced hand. "This stays," she said whenever someone suggested filling it in. "We can lose roof and walls again. We can't lose this." A week after the sky went blue for good, Ezra Wren asked Becker to ride up with him. The storekeeper was a thin man with ink on his fingers and better handwriting than any of the farmers who bought from him. They stood at the table near the stove while Eliza poured them both coffee that tasted more of iron than beans. Ezra cleared his throat. "When I put your name on the paper for this place," he said, "I thought I was washing my hands of it." He swallowed. "Turns out, I was just putting it in the only hands that knew what to do." Becker unfolded a sheet and smoothed it on the plank. He'd written out new words in his neat, slow script. Not to a man. Not back to the church it used to be. To the town. Or what passed for a town this far out. This hall and the ground beneath it, the words said. To be held in common. Kept as a room for work and for winter, open to any who need it. He pointed to the last line. You add anything, Eliza? He asked. She took the pencil and thought a long moment. Then she wrote, in letters less straight but harder pressed, and the place under the floor to be kept as carefully as the place above. Below. The word came out heavier than the others. She underlined it once. There wasn't a big meeting. No speeches. Just people who had been there on the worst night standing around a table in a crooked hall, putting their names where they could. Some scratched an X, some managed messy letters. Some simply laid a hand on the wood and said, I agree. Hattie curled her fingers over the edge of the paper. My boy's lungs are still working because of this floor, she said softly. That's signature enough. The deed went back into Becker's satchel. Understanding stayed in the room. From then on, everyone called it what it had become, the winter room. In summer, it was a place to spread cloth, mend harness, sort seed in the good light. Children stubbed toes on the hatch and were scolded to mind the room that kept you. In autumn, people brought their first cord of wood to stack along the north wall before they filled their own sheds. Not because they wanted Eliza to owe them. Because they did not want to face another storm with an empty brace there. And when the first hard frost silvered the fields, someone, Hattie, or Clem, or Miriam, would always walk over, lift the hatch just enough to feel the breath rising out, and nod. Ready. Eliza grew old in the pattern she had made for herself. Hill, hall, wood, stove, hatch. Winters came lean, winters came kinder. One or two almost fooled people into forgetting. She never did. When younger women asked her why she had dug down instead of just stuffing more rags in the cracks, she did not give them a long lesson. She would walk to the center of the hall, tap the boards once with the toe of her boot, and say, the wind owns everything it can get around. Then she'd tap again, slower. So you build where it can't. The explanation never felt like much on a clear day. It felt like everything when the sky turned bad. In the end, she didn't leave in a storm. Her hands simply stopped trusting axe and saw. Her breath shortened on the hill. On one of the last days she came up, she stood alone in the empty hall at dusk, the stove cold, the sleeve under the floor quiet. She lifted the hatch and felt the air rising, faint and even, as the ground settled from the day's warmth. It still remembered. Good. She murmured. She let the lid fall gently shut and laid her palm flat on the boards. That was the last winter she climbed all the way to the top without help. Years after she was gone, the winter room outlived new roofs, new stoves, new families. Some snow seasons were storylight. The hall only saw extra traffic on the very coldest days. Other years came close to that old storm. Roads vanished. Horses vanished. Patience vanished. Whenever that happened, the path up the hill reappeared as if it had been there all along. Boots stamped it out. Hands lifted the hatch. People who had never seen Eliza Wren in their lives bent to feel the difference between the air above and the air below and said, with quiet relief, it's holding. If you drive past that country years later, the buildings you notice first are the tall ones, the grain elevators, the water towers, the church spires. The winter room isn't tall. It's as low as a choice, a sagging hall on a rise, with a stove that still works and a patch in the floor that sounds different when you knock. You don't see what matters until you stand in the middle and listen. There is no sign with her name. No plaque. Just a simple, stubborn fact built into the boards. When the worst wind the country could remember came looking for heat to steal, the warmest place left was the space one woman carved underneath everyone else's feet.